I just wanted to reheat dinner and sleep after a 10-hour shift. But the unfamiliar SUV parked right in my driveway felt like a territorial claim. The woman behind the wheel wasn't rushed. She stared at me like I was just the final piece of clutter waiting to be cleared from the house. Yet the real chill wasn't my husband walking out to her. It was his effortless calm, as if I had stumbled into their life. My name is Addison Bishop, and as a 39-year-old woman, I spend my life looking for the things other people try to hide. For over 10 hours that day, I had been buried under contract breach files at the North Briar Transit Authority, hunting down the invisible discrepancies in vendor agreements. My eyes were burning. My shoulders carried the rigid tension of a woman who had negotiated against municipal lawyers all afternoon. And all I wanted was the quiet sanctuary of my home. The house in Briar Glen had been in my family for generations. My grandfather built the original frame, and it belonged to me long before Nolan ever walked into my life. It was a solid, steadfast piece of history that always grounded me. The one place where I never had to analyze or defend my territory. I turned my car onto my street, letting the familiar shadows of the old oak trees wash over the windshield. I pulled up to my property, expecting the usual empty stretch of pavement waiting for my tires. Instead, a pearl-white luxury SUV was parked diagonally across my driveway. It was not just occupying space. It was parked with a distinct arrogance. The front wheels turned sharply, deliberately blocking the exact spot where I parked every single night. The engine was idling smoothly, a low, expensive hum that vibrated through the crisp evening air. I put my car in park at the edge of the curb and gripped the steering wheel, letting the engine run for a moment as I processed the visual. Through the glare of the streetlights, I studied the vehicle. There was a sleek, minimalist magnetic decal on the passenger side door, displaying the logo of a high-end real estate brokerage. Behind the steering wheel sat a woman. She did not duck. She did not avert her gaze or pretend to look at her phone. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored emerald blouse, her blonde hair blown out into soft, deliberate waves that caught the amber light of the street lamps. Her posture was relaxed, one wrist draped casually over the leather steering wheel. She exuded the terrifying tranquility of someone who felt entirely entitled to be exactly where she was. There was no shadow of guilt, no nervous shifting. She looked at me through the glass, her expression registering my presence with the mild, detached interest one might reserve for a passing delivery worker who had stopped at the wrong address. The heavy oak front door of my house swung open. The smart lock chimed, a bright, cheerful electronic sound that cut sharply through the silence of the neighborhood. Out stepped Nolan, my husband. He was not wearing the soft, faded gray sweater he usually changed into after a long day at the construction sites. He was wearing his navy blazer, a crisp white button-down shirt, and leather dress shoes that clicked sharply against the wooden porch steps. He looked polished, energized, and entirely out of context for a Tuesday evening at home. Tucked securely under his right arm was a thick, glossy real estate dossier, the kind of heavy, embossed folder reserved for high-net-worth property closures. It was the kind of folder that carried weight, both literally and legally. I stepped out of my car. The evening air hit my face, cold and sharp, biting at my tired skin. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my heels as I walked toward the driveway. As I approached, the tinted window of the Pearl SUV glided down with a quiet, mechanical hum. The woman leaned slightly toward the open window. She looked at me, her lips curving into a faint, polite smile that completely failed to reach her eyes. It was a hollow gesture. It was the kind of smile you give a worker you barely notice, acknowledging their presence while dismissing their importance. Then, she shifted her attention entirely away from me and focused on my husband. "Nolan," she said, her voice smooth, melodic, and carrying perfectly in the quiet air. "We are going to be late for the private viewing." Nolan stopped halfway down the brick walkway. He looked at me, then at her, and his shoulders barely even tensed. There was no sudden panic in his eyes. There was no sudden stammering, no dropping of the folder, no frantic attempt to fabricate a lie about a lost colleague or an emergency meeting. He adjusted his grip on the dossier and let out a short, heavy breath, a sigh of profound inconvenience, as if my arrival was merely a minor scheduling conflict he now had to manage. I stopped walking. I stood halfway between my vehicle at the curb and the Pearl SUV blocking my driveway. The silence between the three of us stretched, thick and suffocating. "You are waiting for my husband in my driveway?" I asked. My voice was perfectly level. I did not yell. I did not let my pitch rise. The sentence hung in the cold air, freezing the oxygen around us. The woman, Sloane Mercer, as I would later learn to call her, merely raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. She did not flinch. She did not offer an excuse. She simply looked at me, allowing the silence to validate my question, and let Nolan do the talking. Nolan took 2 steps closer to me, his expression hardening into a mask of mild irritation. He did not look like a man caught in the ultimate betrayal. He looked like a man annoyed by a disruption in his itinerary. "Addison," he said, his tone dripping with a condescending calmness, "just go inside. Do not make a scene out here in the driveway." He spoke the words as if I were a child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. He spoke as if my presence on my own property was an imposition, an unfortunate variable he had not accounted for in his perfectly structured evening. In that precise moment, a lesser woman might have screamed. I could have thrown my briefcase at his chest. I could have marched up to the open window and demanded Sloane get off my property. But my brain, trained by years of corporate audits, risk assessments, and contract disputes, simply clicked into an entirely different gear. The white-hot rush of emotional betrayal evaporated, instantly replaced by a hyper-vigilant, freezing clarity. I looked at the heavy dossier tucked securely under his arm. I noted the specific shade of the luxury real estate logo on the car door. Memorizing the font and the geometric design, I glanced over his shoulder at the small, glowing red ring of the doorbell camera on the porch, silently documenting the exact minute and second of this interaction. Finally, I looked back at Sloane. Her eyes held an immense, overwhelming amount of confidence. It was not the desperate, clinging confidence of a secret mistress hiding in the shadows. It was the grounded, assured confidence of an owner taking inventory. She was sitting in my driveway, looking at my husband, with the absolute certainty that I was a temporary obstacle waiting to be legally cleared away. I took a slow, deliberate breath and stepped fully into the center of the driveway, planting my feet firmly on the concrete. I stood exactly between the front bumper of the Pearl SUV and my husband, forcing him to walk around me. In that fraction of a second, the entire narrative shifted. The pieces of a puzzle I did not even know I was assembling suddenly snapped together with terrifying precision. A man hiding a simple physical affair would be panicked. A man hiding a simple affair would have made her park 3 streets down in the shadows. A man hiding a simple affair would not be carrying a thick stack of property documents out of my ancestral home while wearing a tailored suit, standing in the bright glare of the streetlights. He was not just sleeping with her. She was not just waiting for a romantic evening at a hotel. They were orchestrating something vastly more permanent, right on top of the very foundation of my life. "I am not making a scene, Nolan," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the idling engine with the precision of a scalpel. "I am simply going to my house." Nolan stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes searching my face for the hysterical breakdown he clearly expected. When he found nothing but cold, unblinking observation, he gave a sharp, dismissive nod. He turned his back on me to walk around the front of the SUV. He opened the passenger door, slid into the leather seat, and the heavy door slammed shut with a definitive, echoing thud. Sloane did not look at me again. She shifted the car into gear, and the tires rolled backward over the concrete. The headlights swept over my face, blinding me for a brief second as they backed out of the driveway and sped off down the dark street. I stood alone in the cold. The scent of expensive exhaust fumes and distant rain lingered in the air. I looked at the empty space where the car had been, tracing the tire marks left on the pavement, and then up at the dark windows of my house. I realized then that my marriage had not just ended, it had been weaponized against me. And as I walked up the wooden steps to my front door, slipping my key into the lock, I knew I was no longer a wife waiting for a tearful explanation. I was an auditor stepping onto an active crime scene. I pushed the heavy oak front door closed, leaning my full body weight against the solid wood until the latch engaged. I turned the brass deadbolt, feeling the mechanical click vibrate through my fingertips. The sharp, metallic sound echoed in the sudden emptiness of the entryway. I did not reach for the light switch. I let the darkness of the hallway wrap around me, navigating the familiar layout of my childhood home by memory and the faint silver moonlight spilling through the high window panes. I dropped my leather work briefcase onto the hallway bench, kicked off my heels, and walked straight into the kitchen. The silence inside the house was absolute, a stark contrast to the vibrating tension I had just left out on the driveway. I filled the electric kettle, the rush of cold tap water sounding unnaturally loud. I measured out dark roast coffee grounds into my French press with steady, deliberate movements. My hands were completely still. The frantic, white-hot rush of adrenaline that usually accompanies a personal trauma had bypassed my heart entirely and settled directly into the analytical center of my brain. I poured the boiling water, watched the dark liquid bloom and settle, and carried a steaming black mug over to the large kitchen island. I pulled one of the tall wooden stools out, sat down, and opened my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across the granite countertop. I was no longer a tired wife returning home to a failed marriage. I was a contract control manager initiating a comprehensive internal audit. I began with the joint financial accounts. Nolan and I maintained a shared checking account for domestic logistics, property taxes, home insurance, and utility bills, while keeping our primary income securely routed to separate personal portfolios. He had always volunteered to manage the monthly balancing of the household ledger. I had let him. In my professional life, trust is a liability that requires constant verification. But I had foolishly treated my marriage as an exempt category. I logged into the banking portal and requested the transaction history going back 12 full months. I did not scan the digital columns looking for massive, dramatic withdrawals. A careless man drains an account and runs. A calculating man siphons. I adjusted the filter to highlight outward transfers, and the pattern materialized almost immediately. They were small, rhythmic, and perfectly calibrated to avoid triggering a low balance alert. There was a transfer of $320 on a random Tuesday. $450 moved out 2 weeks later. $275 disappeared under the guise of an unidentifiable digital cash application handle. If I had glanced at a single monthly statement, I would have dismissed them as minor hardware store runs or expensive client lunches, but laid out sequentially over 365 days. The isolated anomalies formed a massive, undeniable hemorrhage. Thousands of dollars had been quietly bled from our shared resources with surgical precision. I opened a new tab and accessed my archived personal emails. I bypassed the primary inbox and went straight to the system folders. Running a targeted search for terminology I reviewed daily at the Transit Authority. Deed, title, appraisal, escrow. The search engine spun for a fraction of a second before pulling up an automated system notification buried deep in a discarded promotional folder from roughly 8 weeks ago. It was a security alert confirming successful access to an independent property valuation portal. I stared at the screen. I had never registered for that service, nor had I ever clicked that link. The digital footprint, however, showed that the IP address used to access the portal matched our home network router perfectly. I kept the email open and pulled up our shared digital calendar on my phone. Nolan and I used it strictly to coordinate late work schedules and avoid double booking social events. I began cross-referencing the specific dates of the obscure financial transfers and the appraisal portal login with his designated work events. The overlapping data points locked together like teeth in a zipper. On the exact evenings he had blocked out for late client entertainment. His calendar entries were suspiciously vague. He had typed notes like JT walk through, private lender, and site visit. Those were not the standard project management terms he used for his municipal construction jobs. Those were distinct real estate acquisition terms. They aligned flawlessly with the nights he came home late, offering brief apologies while smelling of expensive restaurant air rather than the dust of a construction site. A new, colder suspicion began to form at the base of my skull. I closed the calendar application and opened the security interface for our smart home system. We had installed the electronic deadbolt 2 years prior, assigning unique digital passcodes to our phones for keyless entry. I scrolled backward through the chronological entry logs, comparing the timestamps against my own rigid work schedule. My breath caught flat in my chest. On a Tuesday afternoon at 2:15, the front door had been unlocked using Nolan's specific access credential. I remembered that day clearly because I had been locked in a brutal vendor negotiation at the Transit Authority headquarters. Nolan had sent me a text message that morning complaining about the severe highway traffic delaying his drive to a job site in the Northern District, a location at least 3 hours away. Yet the security log proved otherwise. The system showed the door locking again at 3:45. He had been here. He had been inside the house for an hour and a half in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and based on the heavy, embossed real estate dossier I had seen tucked tightly under his arm in the driveway, I knew with absolute certainty that he had not come home simply to rest. I pushed myself away from the kitchen island. My bare feet made no sound against the cold hardwood as I walked down the dim hallway toward the spare bedroom we used as a home office. The room smelled faintly of old paper and the warm plastic of the laser printer sitting on the corner desk. Nolan was a man who still demanded physical, printed copies of important documents, a tactile habit I had often found endearing. I walked over to the machine. The small LCD screen was dark, but the green status indicator light was slowly pulsing, signaling an incomplete task retained in the local memory spool. I pressed the wake button and navigated through the digital menu to the print history. There was a document stalled in the queue, flagged with a paper-size mismatch error from earlier that same afternoon. I pulled open the bottom tray, loaded a fresh stack of legal-sized paper, and pressed the override button to force the machine to print the retained file. I listened to the internal gears grind and whir, the sound incredibly loud in the silent house. A single sheet of paper slid out onto the output tray, the ink still radiating a faint heat. I picked it up and held it under the direct beam of the desk lamp. It was a draft document. Specifically, it was a boilerplate listing agreement, the standard legal contract used to initiate the public sale of a residential property. I scanned the top section, my eyes locking onto the designated property address. It was my address, the Briar Glen House, the property that had sheltered my family for decades. I dragged my index finger down the thick text of the page. The designated broker representative was printed clearly in bold, black letters. Sloan Mercer. I stared at the name, the letters burning themselves into my retinas. The woman in the pearl SUV. The woman with the immaculate blowout and the perfectly tailored emerald blouse. I moved my finger further down to the final signature block at the bottom of the page, under the section strictly reserved for the primary legal property owner. There was a small, italicized notation bracketed in red ink. It read, "Pending spousal confirmation." The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place, and the resulting picture was utterly grotesque. The woman parked out front had not been a nervous, infatuated mistress waiting in the shadows for a stolen moment of romance. She had been sitting in my driveway with the relaxed, authoritative posture of a professional waiting for an asset to be officially transferred. She was waiting for the paperwork to clear. The infidelity was merely the operational vehicle. The actual destination was the systematic theft of my ancestral home. I walked slowly back to the kitchen and sat down at the island. The black coffee in my mug had gone completely cold, a dark, bitter mirror reflecting the kitchen lights. I did not take a sip. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a biological response to emotional devastation, and I had just realized that this was no longer a matter of a broken heart. This was a calculated, hostile takeover of my life. I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out a fresh, yellow legal pad, and uncapped my heavy metal pen. I drew a harsh, perfectly straight line down the exact center of the first page. On the left side of the line, I began logging the chronological timestamps, moving hour by hour, day by day. On the right side, I documented the corresponding financial transactions, the fabricated calendar entries, the security system breaches, and the drafted listing agreement. I was not writing a tragic diary entry about the death of my marriage. I was meticulously compiling the foundational evidence for the most important breach of contract file I would ever build. At exactly 8 a.m. on Monday, I walked through the glass doors of Mara Keene's law firm in downtown West Haven County. Mara was not a general family law practitioner who dealt with amicable separations or shared custody schedules for household pets. She was a financial predator in a sharply tailored charcoal suit. Her entire practice was dedicated exclusively to high-net-worth divorces involving hidden assets, shell companies, and corporate fraud. I had spent the entire weekend transforming the notes from my yellow legal pad into a meticulously bound, indexed binder. I walked into her corner office and placed it squarely on the center of her polished mahogany desk. Mara opened the heavy binder. She did not offer me a tissue. She did not ask how I was sleeping or if I was holding up okay. She spent 20 solid minutes flipping through the chronological timeline, the bank transfer logs, the security system timestamps, and the printed draft listing agreement. The only sound in the room was the crisp turning of pages and the distant hum of the city traffic below. When she finally looked up, her expression was purely clinical, devoid of any manufactured sympathy. "Infidelity is painful, Addison," Mara said, closing the binder and folding her hands over the cover. "It destroys trust. It shatters the ego. And family court judges frankly hear about it every single day. But in a courtroom, infidelity is just an emotional narrative. Documented financial fraud, however, is a weapon that can flip the entire board." Mara immediately picked up her desk phone and directed her senior paralegal to pull the complete title chain and any pending encumbrances for the Briar Glen property. We sat in silence for 45 minutes while her team navigated the county property registry database. I drank a glass of sparkling water, my mind operating with the cold, detached efficiency of a machine processing raw data. When the paralegal finally returned, she handed Mara a thin manila folder. Mara scanned the first page, her jaw tightening just a fraction of an inch. She slid the document across the smooth wood desk toward me. "Look at the third paragraph," Mara instructed, her voice dropping to a serious, low register. It was a formal banking application for a massive home equity line of credit, a 6-figure loan. Nolan was actively attempting to borrow heavily against the underlying equity of my house. I read the requested figures printed on the page. He was asking for $350,000. "He cannot do this," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the massive adrenaline spike in my chest. "My grandfather left this house directly to me. The deed has been entirely in my name since 2014. That was 3 full years before I even met Nolan." "You are absolutely right," Mara agreed, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against the edge of the page. "Under the law, as an inherited property, it is legally shielded from joint marital assets unless you explicitly commingle the title or the funds. He cannot legally use it as financial leverage without your expressed, documented consent. Which brings us to the second page of this application." I turned the heavy paper over. At the very bottom of the credit authorization form, glowing in bright blue ink against the stark white background, were 2 electronic signatures. One signature belonged to Nolan. The other signature, supposedly, belonged to me. I stared at the digital rendering of my own name. The curve of the letters was slightly off, the pacing entirely wrong. I had never seen this financial document in my life. I had certainly never authorized a digital signature for a massive loan against my own home. "This is forgery," I stated flatly. "It is worse than standard forgery," Mara corrected, leaning back in her heavy leather chair. "It is systemic, premeditated fraud, Look at the notary stamp attached to the appendix. Attached to the final page was a digital certificate of remote online notarization. It legally verified that both Nolan and I had supposedly appeared via a secure video link to confirm our identities and sign the application in real time. But Mara pointed to the digital metadata printed in the tiny margins of the certificate. The timestamp of the remote notarization session was marked as Thursday afternoon at exactly 2:15. I was leading a massive vendor compliance meeting on Thursday at 2:15, I said, tracing the printed timestamp with my index finger. I have departmental attendance logs, recorded audio minutes, and electronic security badge swipes proving I was inside the Transit Authority headquarters with 12 other municipal managers. Mara nodded sharply. And my office will immediately subpoena the Internet Protocol address attached to this remote video session. If I have to bet my law degree, I will wager that the IP address traces back to a location entirely unconnected to your office. Perhaps a certain pearl white luxury vehicle, or a staging office. He either found a rogue notary willing to look the other way, or he bypassed the identity verification system entirely using your stolen data. He used your pristine credit history and the massive equity of your ancestral home to secure a bridge loan. The gravity of the situation settled over me like a suffocatingly heavy winter coat. Nolan was not just cheating on me with a polished real estate broker. He was actively trying to drain the marrow out of my financial stability. "What is our immediate move?" I asked, looking directly into Mara's eyes without blinking. "We freeze the board," she replied without a second of hesitation. "I am filing an emergency injunction and a lis pendens on the Briar Glen property before the county courthouse closes today. This is a formal public notice of pending litigation. It attaches directly to the property deed. The moment my clerk files it, a massive red flag goes up in the county system. No bank will approve that line of credit. No underwriter will touch the title. And Sloan Mercer will not be able to list, sell, or transfer a single blade of grass on that property. We lock the house down completely." "Do it," I said. "I need you to build the financial fortress." Mara continued, pulling a blank legal pad toward her and writing a rapid list. "I need 7 years of tax returns. I need every single receipt for the roof repairs, the kitchen remodel, and the property taxes. I need the homeowner's insurance policy showing exactly who paid the premiums. Most importantly, I need you to map out exactly how he siphoned that joint money. We need to prove the specific intent of the financial drain." I left the law firm at noon and drove straight to my primary bank branch. I sat in a private, glass-walled cubicle with a senior branch manager for 2 hours, requesting certified physical copies of every joint account statement from the past 36 months. I did not explain my crumbling marital situation. I simply cited an impending personal audit for government compliance. I paid the document service fees in cash and walked out with a heavy stack of sealed, stamped envelopes. I returned to the Briar Glen house mid-afternoon. The sun was spilling through the living room windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing lazily in the air. I walked into the home office, ignoring the printer that had betrayed Nolan's secret, and opened the heavy metal filing cabinet in the corner of the room. For the next 4 hours, I worked in absolute, unbreakable silence. I pulled the municipal property tax assessments, proving I had paid the heavy levies entirely from my separate personal account year after year. I found the contractor invoices from when we upgraded the plumbing infrastructure, verifying that the funds came entirely from my private savings. I meticulously cross-referenced the thick stack of joint bank statements with the small, continuous money transfers I had discovered the night before. I was building a solid, impenetrable wall of paper, proving that not only had I maintained the house as an independent asset, but Nolan had been systematically draining our shared resources with a specific, hidden motive. As I highlighted another unauthorized transfer of $500, I stopped and looked out the window at the sprawling green backyard. The truth of the situation finally crystallized in my mind, violently stripping away the last remnants of the woman I had been just 1 week ago. Nolan had never viewed our marriage as a genuine partnership. He had viewed me as a temporary holding company. He needed my pristine credit score, my stable government job, and the massive equity sitting dormant in my grandfather's house. Sloan was simply the industry insider he needed to execute the liquidation of my life. They had sat in my driveway, comfortable and confident, because they believed I was completely blind to the machinery grinding away beneath my feet. They thought I was a naive, overworked bureaucrat who would simply sign whatever paperwork was put in front of her during a chaotic divorce, surrendering the house just to make the emotional pain stop. He was trying to turn me into the final, easily removable obstacle before he swallowed my family home whole. I closed the final bank statement and placed it perfectly aligned on top of the towering stack of evidence. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire nervous system. I had spent my entire career catching municipal contractors who thought they could hide stolen public funds behind clever accounting and smooth talk. Nolan had made the fatal mistake of bringing that exact same game into my house. He thought he was playing a grieving wife. He was about to find out he had challenged an auditor to a blood sport. I shifted my focus away from the banking statements and opened a deeply buried cloud storage drive I had found linked to our shared home network. As the files populated on my screen, my mind drifted to the small, detached carriage house sitting at the far back edge of my property. 14 months ago, Nolan had relentlessly campaigned to renovate it. The structure had been a glorified storage shed for decades, holding broken lawnmowers and my late grandfather's rusted tools. Nolan had framed the project with a passionate, earnest intensity. He called it an investment for our shared future. He promised to do the manual labor himself if I funded the materials, painting a picture of a quiet, sunlit guest suite where we could eventually host family or perhaps rent it out for passive income. I had transferred $30,000 from my personal savings to cover the lumber, the plumbing, and the electrical permits. I clicked on a folder vaguely titled Property Assets and found a subfolder marked Staging. My screen filled with dozens of high-resolution, professionally edited photographs. My breath hitched, though my pulse remained steady. The images were of the carriage house, but it was not a cozy guest suite. The interior had been transformed into an immaculate, high-end commercial reception space. There was a sleek minimalist conference table made of dark walnut, surrounded by 6 leather executive chairs. A custom wet bar sat in the corner, stocked with premium liquor. Abstract art hung on the freshly painted walls. The metadata on the files indicated the photos had been taken just 3 weeks ago by a premium commercial architectural photographer. Nolan had not built a space for our shared future. He had used my money to construct a private, off-the-books transaction hub right in my own backyard, designed exclusively to impress high-net-worth clients and private lenders without ever bringing them into the main house. I dug deeper into the synced communication logs, accessing a cached version of his messaging application that had inadvertently backed up to our shared family tablet. I began reading his outgoing messages to mutual acquaintances, local contractors, and golf partners. The narrative he was spinning was chilling in its casual cruelty. To a man named Greg, he had written that Addison and I have been functionally estranged for over a year and a half. To another associate, he claimed we were living completely separate lives under the same roof, only maintaining a polite public facade because a messy divorce would threaten my municipal government clearance. He was systematically laying the social groundwork, planting seeds of a mutual, amicable decay so that when he finally pulled the trigger, no one in our social circle would question his sudden departure or his claim to half the assets. He had isolated me socially before I even knew I was alone. But the social lies were nothing compared to the procedural manipulation. I found an email chain from late last autumn, and a wave of profound, acidic nausea finally hit me. My father had passed away suddenly in November. For 2 solid months, I had been submerged in a suffocating fog of grief, barely able to manage my demanding work hours, let alone monitor my household with my usual scrutiny. I vividly remembered sitting on the living room sofa, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the wall. Nolan had been so attentive during that period. He had brought me hot tea, managed the grocery shopping, and handled the incoming mail. One evening, he had gently set a thick stack of documents on my lap, murmuring soothingly about routine tax planning and necessary financial restructuring to protect my inheritance. He had pointed to the bottom of several pages, handing me a pen. I had signed them blindly, trusting the man who was holding my hand while I mourned my father. I now realized I had likely signed the preliminary authorizations that allowed him to begin restructuring the title of my home. He had weaponized my deepest vulnerability. The final pieces of the architecture revealed themselves in a series of encrypted emails between Nolan and a private commercial equity firm based in a neighboring state. The subject lines all referenced a single project name, Juniper Trace. I read through the dense financial jargon, my legal background translating the corporate speak effortlessly. Juniper Trace was a massive, speculative luxury development. Nolan was not just a hired contractor on this project. He was attempting to position himself as a primary equity partner. But to buy his seat at the table, he needed a massive injection of liquid capital. The emails explicitly detailed that his bridge loan application was severely short on acceptable collateral. The private lender was threatening to pull the entire funding package. Nolan was given a hard deadline. He had exactly 10 days to secure the required collateral, or he would lose his buy-in for Juniper Trace entirely. This was where Sloan Mercer transformed from a simple mistress into a vital corporate asset. Sloan was the designated broker for the Juniper Trace development. Her emails to Nolan were strictly business, devoid of romantic sentiment. She was advising him on how to expedite the equity extraction from a secondary residential property. She was the one who had arranged the fraudulent remote notary. She was the one who had drafted the listing agreement for my house to prove to the investors that Nolan was liquidating assets to meet their demands. She was not sleeping with my husband because she loved him. She was sleeping with him because he was her ticket to a massive commercial commission. And my house was the sacrificial lamb required to make the deal close. Then, I found the single line of text that turned my blood cold. It was a direct message sent from Nolan to Sloan. Time-stamped late last Thursday night. Do not worry about the final signatures. He had written, "She is so exhausted she will not even notice until after closing is done." I stared at those glowing words for a very long time. I read them until the letters blurred together on the screen. That sentence did not break my heart. It did not make me mourn the vows we had taken or the years we had spent together. It did not make me feel the sharp, frantic sting of romantic betrayal. Instead, it ignited a cold, calculated, and terrifying rage deep within my chest. Nolan had built this entire intricate, fraudulent empire upon a single, foundational assumption. He believed I was weak. He believed I was blind. He looked at my exhaustion, my grief, and my dedication to my career, and he saw a domesticated, compliant woman who could be easily managed and quietly discarded. He thought my silence was stupidity. He thought my trust in him was a symptom of a slow, easily manipulated mind. He had comfortably arranged the theft of my legacy from the dining room table because he genuinely believed I did not possess the intellect or the spine to catch him. I closed the laptop, the sudden darkness reflecting my own face in the glossy screen. The quiet of the house no longer felt empty. It felt like a staging ground. I was no longer interested in salvaging my marriage, and I certainly was not interested in a messy, emotional confrontation in a divorce court just to vent my anger. Screaming at him would only validate his belief that I was hysterical and out of control. I did not want to merely expose him to his friends for the sake of petty revenge. My objective shifted entirely in that moment. I did not just want to keep my house. I wanted to systematically dismantle the arrogant, fictional narrative he had constructed about me. I wanted to let him believe he was winning. I was going to let him build his bridge to Juniper Trace, and the moment he believed he had crossed it safely, I was going to bring the whole thing down. Nolan walked through the front door just after 8 o'clock in the evening, carrying himself with the exhausted, patient posture of a man fully prepared to gracefully forgive a misunderstanding. He hung his coat on the brass hook in the hallway, his movements deliberately slow and unthreatening. I was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace, a heavy book resting closed on my lap, watching him orchestrate his entrance. He stepped into the living room, running a hand through his hair, and adopted that low, pacifying tone he typically reserved for calming down angry subcontractors at his job sites. "Addison," he began, offering a soft, condescending sigh. "We need to talk about yesterday. I want to explain this civilly, like adults. You are letting your imagination run wild because of the stress at your office." I did not speak. I simply let my eyes rest on his face, allowing the silence to stretch across the room. "Sloan is simply an investment partner," he continued, taking a step closer, encouraged by my lack of screaming. "That is all she is. My firm is looking at a new commercial property development, and she is a broker helping us navigate the zoning laws. She was just dropping off some feasibility reports yesterday. I know exactly how it looked, seeing her parked out there, but you are jumping to massive, unfair conclusions. We have been distant lately. I know that. But there is no conspiracy here." He waited for the explosion. He was thoroughly braced for tears, for hurled accusations, for a chaotic emotional breakdown that would allow him to play the victim of my irrational paranoia. He needed me to be hysterical so he could be the voice of reason. "Starting tonight, you will sleep on the sofa in the living room," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any measurable emotion. "Furthermore, any future discussions regarding our shared financial accounts will go directly through my attorney. Finally, you will never invite anyone onto this property without my explicit, prior consent, ever again." Nolan blinked. The rhythm of his carefully rehearsed script completely derailed. My absolute lack of emotional volatility confused him. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. A sound meant to dismiss my demands as a temporary tantrum. "An attorney Addie. Come on. That is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising as his confidence wavered. "We do not need to escalate this to lawyers. There is no money missing from our accounts. There is absolutely no affair going on. And I certainly have not even thought about listing the house or doing anything crazy like that." I filed that phrase away immediately. I had never mentioned listing the house or selling the property. It was the kind of unforced mistake only a guilty man makes. "The living room. Nolan," I repeated. I stood up, walked past him without making eye contact, and headed straight up the stairs. Over the next 72 hours, while Nolan aggressively performed the role of the patient, deeply misunderstood husband, I turned my own home into a silent surveillance hub. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating, yet I moved through it with the precision of a ghost. Whenever he left for his supposed job sites, I went to work. I sat in my home office and quietly synced the front porch security camera directly to a secure, partitioned hard drive on my personal laptop. I downloaded the internal digital logs from the laser printer, capturing every file name that had passed through its memory in the last 90 days. I logged into the Postal Service portal, archiving every scanned image of incoming mail, delivery receipts, and certified document packages that had arrived at the house while I was at my municipal office. On Thursday afternoon, I took a half day from the transit authority to wait for a routine pest control inspection. I was standing on the front porch, enjoying a brief moment of fresh air, when Della Knox walked slowly up my driveway. Della was my 72-year-old neighbor from the adjacent property, a woman who treated neighborhood observation as a competitive sport. She was carrying a small plastic container of lemon cookies. "Addison, dear," Della said, handing me the container with a warm smile. "I just wanted to bring these over and make sure everything was all right. You have had so much unusual traffic over here lately." "Traffic, Della?" I asked gently. I kept my posture entirely relaxed, leaning against the wooden porch railing so as not to spook her or make her feel interrogated. "Well, yes," she continued, adjusting the collar of her thick cardigan. "The appraiser with the laser measuring tool last week. He spent nearly 2 hours walking the perimeter. And then the locksmith a few days ago. That man was very loud. He parked his work van right on my grass line." My heart performed a slow, freezing revolution inside my chest. "A locksmith. Oh, yes," Della nodded, completely oblivious to the tectonic plates shifting violently beneath my feet. I walked over to politely ask him to move his van off my lawn. He apologized and told me the homeowner had hired him to change the secondary access codes on the back carriage house. He said there was going to be a residential transition phase very soon, so the owner needed upgraded, independent security for the new occupants. A residential transition phase. That was not the language of a blue-collar locksmith. That was pure, polished real estate broker jargon. That was Sloane Mercer speaking her professional vocabulary through a hired contractor. I thanked Della profusely, took the cookies inside, and immediately locked the door. I bypassed the kitchen entirely and called Mara Keene. I repeated Della's exact words to my attorney, within 2 hours. Mara's paralegal had aggressively cross-referenced local vendor registries and subpoenaed the service records. Mara emailed me the digital files shortly before 5 o'clock. I opened the attachments on my laptop screen. The first document was a finalized invoice from a highly rated commercial appraiser in West Haven County. The second document was a detailed work order from a premium security locksmith company. Both documents shared one glaring, undeniable detail. In the designated box for the legal property owner's name, Nolan had listed himself as the sole representative. My name was completely absent from the paperwork. He had physically stood on my ancestral property, looked a licensed contractor directly in the eye, and claimed absolute, unilateral ownership of my home. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen as the true scope of the danger crystallized. Nolan was moving much faster than I had originally calculated. The 10-day deadline for the Juniper Trace Bridge loan was closing around his neck like a vice, and panic was making him bold. He was not merely preparing the fraudulent financial paperwork anymore. He was physically securing the premises. He had changed the access codes on my own carriage house to lock me out of the very space he was using as his staging ground. And Sloane Mercer was right there beside him, guiding the contractors and feeding them the script. She was not just a naive woman waiting for her lover to leave his difficult wife. She was deeply embedded in the execution. Nolan had promised her the entire kingdom. He had promised her the massive commercial commission, a cut of the equity, and the absolute control of the Briar Glen property. They were moving in lockstep, entirely convinced that I was sitting quietly in the main house, paralyzed by sadness, completely unaware that the ground beneath me had already been sold. I sat in the glow of my monitor, my eyes burning from the harsh white light. As I continued to excavate the digital wreckage of my marriage, I had already secured the perimeter of my physical property. But the deeper I dug into Nolan's archived email server, the more I realized his ambition was not confined to real estate. It bled directly into my professional life. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I uncovered a thread of communications sent over 3 months ago. The subject line referenced a preliminary vendor bid for the North Briar Transit Authority, my exact place of employment. I opened the chain, and the air left my lungs. Nolan was corresponding with a regional supplier for heavy construction materials, a company actively trying to secure a massive municipal contract for the upcoming light rail expansion. In the second paragraph of his pitch, Nolan casually dropped my name. He did not explicitly promise a guaranteed win. He was too cowardly for outright bribery. Instead, he painted a masterpiece of implication. He told the supplier that his firm had a unique, soft entry into the Transit Authority's procurement division. He mentioned that his wife was the contract control manager, emphasizing that he had direct, unfiltered insight into the board's evaluation criteria. He was selling my integrity as a value-added service to his own private business dealings. If I stayed silent and this email ever surfaced during a routine municipal audit, I would be finished. The government did not care about the nuances of a failing marriage. They would look at the timeline, see that I was married to a man leveraging my position to court vendors, and conclude that I was either a willing participant or criminally negligent. Nolan had not just risked my home. He had unknowingly handed a loaded gun to my enemies, creating a scenario where he could quietly blackmail me into submission if I ever tried to fight him in court. He assumed I would be too terrified of a public scandal to ever expose him. He calculated incorrectly. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I did not go to my usual desk. I walked straight down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of the Transit Authority headquarters and knocked on the heavy glass door of the Ethics and Compliance office. I sat across from Marcus Thorne, the Senior Compliance Director. I did not cry. I did not ask for pity. I placed a printed copy of Nolan's email chain precisely in the center of his desk. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "I am formally self-reporting a potential conflict of interest regarding an upcoming vendor bid. I discovered last night that my husband has been inappropriately invoking my name and my position to imply he has leverage over our procurement process. I have had absolutely no involvement in his communications, and I am requesting an immediate, independent review of all contracts tied to his associates." Marcus read the email. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning unit. When he looked up, his expression was entirely professional, but the warmth had vanished. In the public sector, even the shadow of corruption was a contagion. "Addison," Marcus replied slowly, choosing his words with deliberate care, "you understand the protocol here. By initiating this report, I have to temporarily remove you from the Active Contract Review Board pending a full internal investigation. You will be restricted to administrative oversight." "I understand completely," I answered without hesitation. "I welcome the audit." The fallout was immediate and deeply uncomfortable. By lunchtime, my access credentials for the active procurement servers were suspended. When I walked into the break room, the casual conversations between my colleagues abruptly stopped. I felt the weight of their speculative stares burning into my back as I poured a cup of coffee. My reputation, built over 12 years of flawless, meticulous work, was suddenly under an intense, unforgiving microscope. It was a humiliating, agonizing process, but as I sat alone at my isolated desk, I felt a profound sense of power. I had embraced the short-term pain to completely neutralize Nolan's long-term leverage. He could no longer threaten to ruin my career, because I had already set the fire myself. Later that evening, Nolan returned home, still playing the role of the exhausted, accommodating husband. He had no idea the trap he thought he had set for me had already been dismantled. He believed I was still sitting in the dark, paralyzed by the fear of losing my job and my husband at the same time. He asked how my day at the office was, offering a patronizing smile, and I simply told him it was standard, bureaucratic paperwork. But the ethics department moved faster than either of us anticipated. 2 days later, Marcus Thorne called me back into his office. The compliance team had run a deep forensic trace on the vendor mentioned in Nolan's email. They discovered that the supplier had recently partnered with a secondary consulting firm to bolster their bid. Marcus handed me a printed corporate registry document. "We found a structural anomaly. Addison. The consulting firm attached to this vendor bid is a recently registered shell company. Do you recognize the financial routing numbers attached to their operational accounts?" I looked down at the paper. The name of the holding company meant nothing to me, but the registered financial account routed to its operations sent a shockwave through my nervous system. It was the exact same routing number I had traced in my kitchen earlier that week. The small, steady streams of money Nolan had been siphoning from our joint checking account over the past year had not been going to a secret savings fund or a separate romantic getaway account. They had been feeding this exact shell company to artificially inflate its operating capital. The trap was no longer just a messy domestic affair. It had mutated into a massive, undeniable web of financial fraud and the abuse of municipal relationships for private profit. As I drove home that evening, the entire blueprint finally laid itself out in my mind. A perfect, horrific schematic. Nolan needed an enormous amount of liquid capital for his buy-in at Juniper Trace. He needed the Briar Glen house to act as the massive collateral to secure that bridge loan. He needed Sloan Mercer, the ambitious real estate broker, to orchestrate the fraudulent appraisals and handle the eventual liquidation of the asset. And finally, he needed my pristine, untouchable reputation as a government official to act as the ultimate cover, a shield of credibility that would make his private investors feel secure. I was not just a wife he had grown tired of. I was the foundational asset of his entire criminal enterprise. Every single move he had made, from the slow drain of our bank account to the fake smiles over dinner, was designed to keep me docile while he hollowed out my life. I parked my car on the street, refusing to pull into the driveway. I looked at the dark silhouette of my house against the evening sky. He had built his entire strategy on the assumption that I would protect my pride and my career at all costs, shrinking into the shadows to avoid a scandal. He relied on the predictability of my silence, but he forgot one critical detail about the woman he married. I spent my life dismantling corrupt structures, and I was going to tear his down to the bedrock. The architecture of my survival began to assemble itself from the most unlikely corners of my life. When a structure is rotting from the inside, the people standing on the periphery often see the decay long before the person living inside the walls. Tessa Clay had been my closest confidant since our university days. She was now a senior records archivist for West Haven County, a woman whose entire professional existence revolved around the permanent, unalterable truth of municipal documentation. When I finally sat in her living room and laid out the sterile, terrifying facts of my husband's financial maneuvers, Tessa did not offer me a glass of wine or a shoulder to cry on. She offered me the full weight of the county registry, operating strictly within the legal parameters of her clearance. Tessa became the essential navigator for my attorney, Mara Keene. Tessa knew exactly which digital cues to monitor and which archaic filing systems held the blind spots where a man like Nolan might try to slip a fraudulent deed transfer through the system. She provided the legal breadcrumbs that allowed Mara to anticipate his moves before he even made them. The most devastating breach in Nolan's defenses, however, came from his own bloodline. Grant Bishop was Nolan's younger cousin, a pragmatic, quiet man who had intentionally distanced himself from the family over a decade ago. I had not spoken to Grant in over 3 years, when my phone vibrated on a Tuesday evening displaying his name. I answered with cautious hesitation. Grant sounded exhausted, his voice carrying the heavy resignation of a man who could no longer tolerate a charade. He told me he simply could not stomach it anymore. Nolan had been aggressively holding court at a recent family dinner, fueled by expensive bourbon and his own inflated ego, boasting to the extended relatives about acquiring a massive new residential property very soon. Grant, naturally suspicious of Nolan's sudden influx of supposed wealth, had pressed him for details. In response, Nolan had sent him a series of arrogant text messages. Grant forwarded the digital screenshots directly to my phone while we were still on the call. I opened the images, my eyes scanning the harsh blue bubbles of text. In one message, Nolan had explicitly written, "I am going to lock down control of the Briar Glen place before New Year's. She will not even know what hit her until I have the capital secured." It was the ultimate smoking gun. It was not just a confession of infidelity or a vague implication of financial trouble. It was documented. Undeniable proof of premeditated intent to defraud me of my ancestral property. Armed with Grant's screenshots and the falsified loan application, Mara went straight before a county judge in a closed emergency session. The judicial response was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours, the court officially granted a temporary restraining order on the Briar Glen property. The legal mandate was absolute. It explicitly forbade any listing, transferring, selling, or attaching of any new financial encumbrances to the house until the dispute was formally resolved in a court of law. The invisible trap I had been carefully wiring had officially snapped shut. Nolan discovered the blockade on a Thursday evening. I was standing at the kitchen island, calmly pouring a glass of cold water, when he threw the heavy front door open with enough force to rattle the glass panes. His usual polished, patronizing calm was entirely gone. He marched into the kitchen, his face flushed with a genuine, unfiltered rage I had never seen in all our years of marriage. He slammed a crumpled, heavy stock legal notice onto the marble countertop. He yelled, his voice echoing sharply off the tile backsplash, demanding to know what kind of psychotic, paranoid game I was playing. He accused me of trying to ruin his business out of pure, hysterical spite over a simple misunderstanding. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, letting the silence stretch until his anger hung awkwardly in the air, unsupported and ignored. Seeing that his intimidation tactic was utterly useless against my absolute stillness, Nolan executed a terrifyingly fast psychological pivot. It was chilling how quickly he could switch his masks. He took a deep, shuddering breath, ran his hands forcefully through his hair, and lowered his posture. His voice dropped into a soft, pleading register. "Addison, please," he said, stepping closer to the island, his eyes projecting a manufactured vulnerability. "We can fix this. You are escalating this way out of proportion. Let us just make a quiet settlement between us. You sign a few release papers for the property. Let me secure this one deal. And I swear I will walk away quietly. You will get a fair cut. And more importantly, you will not have to make a big deal out of this in front of your ethics board at the transit authority. We can keep your professional reputation perfectly clean. Your colleagues never need to find out." He persisted in using my profession as leverage against me. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I had already walked straight into the ethics department and permanently closed that door on my own terms. He was offering to protect a secret I had already exposed. I simply looked at him, gave a faint, dismissive nod, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him negotiating with the air. While Nolan was busy desperately trying to plug the holes in his sinking narrative, Mara had deployed a ruthlessly efficient forensic accountant to dissect our financial history. Within a week, the accountant uncovered the central artery of the fraud. It was a completely secret limited liability company named Sable Arc Holdings. The structure was beautifully malicious in its simplicity. The small, steady streams of money Nolan had been quietly siphoning from our joint checking account over the past 12 months flowed directly into the accounts of Sable Arc Holdings. From that secure shell, the money was then funneled cleanly into the Juniper Trace commercial development as his preliminary buy in capital. Then, the final, unexpected piece of the puzzle arrived silently in my digital inbox. It was an email originating from a secure, encrypted address containing a single scanned document. The sender, who remained anonymous in the text, was an administrative assistant working directly at Sloan Mercer's premium real estate brokerage. I opened the attachment. It was the master invoice for the luxury staging of my backyard carriage house. Every single cent of the staging process, from the designer furniture rentals to the premium ambient lighting and the commercial photographer, had been billed directly to Nolan's personal credit card. There was absolutely no official client file registered with the brokerage. There was no standard representation contract backing the massive expense. I stared at the glowing invoice, a sudden profound realization washing over my entire body. Sloan Mercer was undeniably a predator, but she was currently swimming in a tank that Nolan had built, and she did not realize the glass was cracking. He had likely promised her the massive, lucrative commission on the Briar Glen sale, using her industry access, her vendor connections, and her notary to legitimize his collateral for the investors. But he was making her take on all the severe professional risk while he paid the operational costs entirely under the table. Sloan was not just his glamorous mistress. She was not a co-conspirator operating on equal footing. She was just another disposable asset he was manipulating to buy his way into the Juniper Trace project. If the entire deal collapsed, Nolan would attempt to walk away and declare bankruptcy. But Sloan, having attached her name to forged documents and unregistered staging events, would lose her broker license permanently for participating in serious property fraud. He was using her just as ruthlessly as he was using me. I smiled. A cold, sharp movement of my lips in the empty room. I could have easily forwarded the staging invoice and the Sable Arc financial traces directly to Sloan's office. I could have blown up their toxic alliance right then and there, watching them tear each other apart. But interrupting an enemy while they are making a catastrophic mistake is a terrible strategy. I decided to maintain my absolute silence. I was going to let Nolan continue to push himself right to the very edge of the cliff, dragging Sloan along blindly with him, until neither of them had a single inch of solid ground left to stand on. The invitation to the Juniper Trace Winter Preview and Charity Fundraiser was designed to be a blinding display of fabricated success. It was held on the second Friday of December inside the flagship model home of the new development, a sprawling, violently modern structure constructed almost entirely of steel and floor-to-ceiling glass. Nolan had intended to use this high-profile social event as his grand unofficial debut. It was the perfect stage for him to parade his new, elevated status, schmooze with the private equity backers, and subtly introduce Sloan Mercer to his professional ecosystem not as a secret mistress, but as his formidable new partner in both business and life. He operated on the fundamental assumption that I would never dare to attend. In his mind, I was the discarded, humiliated wife who would cower at home, terrified of the social stigma and desperate to avoid a public scene. He severely underestimated my endurance. I did not fear the judgment of his shallow corporate circle. I had spent my entire adult life navigating rooms full of aggressive, entitled contractors, and I was not about to surrender my dignity to a man who was actively trying to steal my legacy. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, I stepped out of a black town car in front of the brightly lit model home. I did not wear a heavy ball gown or anything desperate for attention. I wore a tailored, architectural black crepe jumpsuit with a sharp blazer, completely devoid of jewelry except for my father's vintage silver watch. I looked severe, professional, and entirely untouchable. I was flanked by Mara Keene, who looked like a predatory shark in a midnight blue suit, and a sharply dressed legal process server named David, who carried a thick sealed manila envelope. We walked through the towering glass front doors and stepped into the massive, vaulted foyer. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catered hors d'oeuvres, heavy winter perfumes, and the soft, rhythmic hum of a live jazz trio playing in the corner. I did not cause a commotion. I did not storm the room. We simply glided through the crowd with a chilling, purposeful silence. Our absolute lack of forced social smiling was enough to make the surrounding guests unconsciously step aside, parting the room for us like a physical wedge. I spotted Nolan immediately. He was standing near the expansive custom wet bar at the far end of the great room, holding a crystal glass of amber liquid. He was holding court with 3 older men wearing expensive, tailored suits. I recognized 2 of them instantly from the Transit Authority vendor files. One was the regional manager of his construction firm, and the other was the primary private equity investor for the Juniper Trace project. Sloan Mercer was standing perfectly positioned at Nolan's right side. She wore a stunning crimson silk dress, her hand resting lightly and possessively on his forearm. She was smiling, radiating the intoxicating glow of a woman who believed she had successfully navigated a complex acquisition. Mara, David, and I stopped exactly 10 feet away from their tight circle, partially obscured by a massive floral arrangement. The ambient noise of the party masked our approach, allowing me to clearly hear the confident cadence of Sloane's voice as she conversed with the primary investor. "The initial staging is already complete. Richard," Sloane said smoothly, sipping her champagne, "Nolan has a brilliant eye for asset transition. We are just wrapping up the final legal clearances. But we will be fully moving our primary residence into the Briar Glen property right after the 1st of January. It is going to be a phenomenal foundational asset for our expanded portfolio." She had just publicly confirmed it. She had enthusiastically claimed ownership of my ancestral home to a major financial backer, validating every single paranoid lie Nolan had fed her. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement, crossing the final few feet of polished hardwood floor. The overhead pendant lights caught my face, and the regional manager was the first to notice my approach. His polite smile faltered. "That is a fascinating timeline." "Sloane," I said. My voice was not loud, but the icy, precise diction sliced cleanly through the jazz music and the surrounding chatter. "It is especially fascinating considering you do not own a single brick, shingle, or blade of grass attached to that property." Nolan whipped his head around. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. The crystal glass in his hand trembled so violently that the ice clinked against the rim. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a commanding, dismissive response, but his throat seized entirely. Before Nolan could utter a single syllable of defense, David stepped smoothly around me. He moved with the practiced, unapologetic efficiency of a man who served legal destruction for a living. David extended the thick manila envelope, pressing it directly against the lapel of Nolan's tailored suit until Nolan reflexively brought his free hand up to grasp it. "Nolan Bishop," David stated clearly, his voice carrying the heavy, unmistakable weight of the legal system. "You are officially served with an emergency injunction, a notice of lis pendens, and a formal preservation of evidence order regarding the contested property at Briar Glen." The silence that radiated outward from our small circle was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire party. The primary investor stepped back, his eyes darting frantically between me, the legal envelope, and Nolan's horrified expression. In high-level commercial real estate, the phrase emergency injunction was a toxic, radioactive warning siren. Nolan stood frozen, staring at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. But Sloane was a licensed real estate broker. Her professional survival instincts overrode her shock. She snatched the heavy envelope out of Nolan's paralyzed grip, ripped the seal open, and aggressively pulled out the stack of heavily stamped court documents. Her eyes darted rapidly over the dense legal text. I watched the exact moment her arrogant facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She read the bolded headers detailing the fraudulent remote notary. She saw the explicit judicial lock on the property title. She saw the highlighted dispute regarding the forged spousal signature on the bridge loan application. Most importantly, she saw her own name repeatedly cited in Mara's filing, directly implicating her real estate license in a massive, premeditated effort to defraud a legal homeowner. Sloane slowly lowered the papers. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. She turned her head and looked at Nolan, but she was no longer looking at a successful, wealthy developer who was leaving a cold, unloving wife. She was looking at a desperate, broke fraudster who had used her industry credentials to build a house of cards. "You told me the deed was cleared," Sloane hissed, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of raw panic and absolute fury. "You looked me in the eye and told me your wife had signed the transfer agreements last month. You told me the equity was legally yours to leverage." "Sloane, please, keep your voice down," Nolan begged, finally finding his voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic, reedy whisper. "I can explain everything. It is just a temporary legal misunderstanding. Addison is just being vindictive." "A misunderstanding?" Sloane demanded, her voice rising sharply, entirely abandoning any pretense of party etiquette. She shoved the papers hard against his chest. "There is a judge's signature on a restraining order against the title. You used my private notary to forge her signature. You ran the staging invoices through accounts tied to my name. You did not want me as a partner, Nolan. You needed a shield so you would not go to federal prison alone." The regional manager and the private equity investor exchanged a single, horrified glance. The investor immediately set his drink down on the nearest table, his face hardening into a mask of pure disgust, without a word. He turned his back on Nolan and walked straight toward the coat check. The regional manager followed him a second later, actively pulling out his phone to call his corporate legal department. The bridge loan was dead. The Juniper Trace buy-in was completely vaporized. The social atmosphere in the room flipped with terrifying speed. The hushed whispers of the surrounding guests grew louder, echoing off the glass walls. The narrative Nolan had spent months carefully cultivating was incinerated in less than 3 minutes. He was instantly reduced to a cautionary tale. A man who had gambled his marriage, his career, and his wealthy mistress on a reckless, illegal fantasy, and lost everything simultaneously. I did not stay to watch the final, miserable collapse. I did not need to hurl insults or demand an apology. My absolute silence was the heaviest weapon in the room. I turned smoothly on my heel, maintaining my perfect, unbothered posture. Mara and David fell into step right beside me. We walked out of the model home, leaving Nolan standing paralyzed in the center of the glittering room, surrounded by a crowd of influential people who finally saw exactly who he was. A cornered person does not surrender quietly when the trap closes. They lash out at whatever is nearest. Nolan's total humiliation at the Juniper Trace model home did not force him into a quiet retreat. Instead, it triggered a frantic, scorched earth counteroffensive. Less than 72 hours after the disastrous party, a process server arrived at my municipal office. Nolan had filed an aggressive emergency petition in family court, demanding exclusive legal use and occupancy of the Briar Glen house for the duration of our separation. His sworn affidavit was a masterpiece of legal fiction. He accused me of severe emotional instability. He claimed I had orchestrated a vindictive, psychotic campaign of professional retaliation, intentionally sabotaging his commercial investments out of pure, unhinged jealousy. To bolster this narrative, his attorney submitted a digital file containing several compiled audio recordings. Sitting in Mara Keene's office, we listened to the clips. The audio was heavily spliced and aggressively edited. There was a clip of my voice sounding icy and authoritative, saying, "I am going to completely dismantle your position." It was a sentence I had spoken during a heated, mock negotiation prep session for work 3 years ago. Another clip featured me stating, "You are never coming back onto this property." It was a recording of me talking on the phone to a negligent landscaping contractor last summer, strung together out of context, accompanied by Nolan's theatrical sighs and carefully modulated responses. The compilation painted a chilling picture of a cold, calculating, and deeply abusive wife actively destroying her innocent husband's life. For a brief, terrifying moment, I felt a shadow of doubt creep into the room. Family court judges were human, and a compelling, emotional narrative could occasionally blind a courtroom to the sterile facts. Nolan was betting everything on the hope that if he made me look crazy enough, the judge would temporarily grant him the house just to physically separate us, giving him the occupancy he desperately needed to satisfy his remaining private lenders. But a narrative built on manipulated emotion cannot withstand the crushing weight of verified data. My first profound victory came from the very place Nolan had tried to use as his primary weapon. 2 days after Nolan filed his petition, Marcus Thorne called me back into the Ethics and Compliance Office at the North Briar Transit Authority. He slid a crisp, heavily stamped official document across his desk. The internal audit was completely finished, because I had proactively self-reported the potential conflict of interest well before any formal vendor decisions had been executed. The board determined I had strictly adhered to all municipal compliance policies. My professional record remained flawlessly clean. I was fully reinstated to the contract review board. Nolan's accusation that I was leveraging my government position for domestic retaliation evaporated instantly into thin air. With my career securely locked down, Mara and I turned our full, devastating attention to Nolan's fabricated timeline. In his sworn affidavit, he claimed that on a specific Tuesday afternoon, I had suffered a violent, screaming breakdown, forcing him to flee the house in terror. He claimed he had to seek refuge in his vehicle, afraid for his physical safety. It was the exact same Tuesday he had snuck into the house to print the fraudulent listing agreement. Mara simply attached the corresponding data logs to our counter-filing. We submitted the smart lock digital entry records, which proved I was not even inside the house during the hours he claimed I was screaming at him. We submitted the timestamps from the front porch camera, showing him entering the home completely alone, looking relaxed and highly focused. Finally, we attached the internal memory log from the home printer, verifying that during his supposed desperate flight for safety, he was actually spending 35 minutes troubleshooting a paper jam to print an illegal real estate contract. The defense did not stop with digital metadata. Mara had aggressively deposed the local contractors Nolan had used to secure the carriage house. The commercial appraiser and the residential locksmith were both highly respected professionals in West Haven County. They were absolutely furious that Nolan had unknowingly dragged their operating licenses into a massive property fraud investigation. Neither man was willing to risk perjury for a disgraced developer. They both signed sworn notarized affidavits, confirming that Nolan had confidently introduced himself as the sole unilateral owner of the Briar Glen property. They testified that when questioned about the secondary signature requirement, Nolan casually waved it off, claiming his wife had already given her full verbal consent over the phone and that the paperwork was merely a formality. Then, the forensic accountant delivered the final, fatal blow to Sloan Mercer's carefully constructed image as an innocent bystander. By tracing the exact chronological timeline of the Sable Arc Holdings shell account, the accountant discovered a massive, glaring synchronization. The bridge loan Nolan had secured for the Juniper Trace project was scheduled to completely default, triggering a catastrophic financial implosion. On the exact same Friday that Sloan Mercer first parked her Pearl luxury vehicle in my driveway. She had not been sitting there simply to mark romantic territory or to pressure Nolan into leaving me. She had been physically sitting on the collateral. The clock was running out on their fraudulent loan. And she was waiting for the keys. She was waiting for the physical asset to be surrendered because their mutual financial survival depended on it entirely. But the most unexpected and breathtaking twist of the entire legal preparation came from the last person I ever expected to stand in my corner. Evelyn Bishop, Nolan's mother. Evelyn had never particularly liked me. She thought I was too rigid, too entirely focused on my career, and severely lacking the soft, nurturing domestic qualities she believed her son deserved. When the separation began, she naturally rallied fiercely behind Nolan, ready to testify to his pristine character and my supposed emotional frigidity. Nolan's attorney formally called her to provide a character deposition, hoping she would swear under oath that the Briar Glen house had always been treated as a joint marital asset, a shared family home rather than my strict personal inheritance. During the deposition, Mara did not argue with Evelyn. She did not raise her voice or attack the woman's maternal instincts. Mara simply slid the printed evidence across the conference table. She showed Evelyn the forged digital notary stamp bearing my name. She showed her the aggressive, arrogant emails Nolan had sent to the private equity investors, bragging about easily stripping me of my generational wealth. Evelyn Bishop was a difficult woman, but she was not a criminal, and she possessed a rigid, uncompromising sense of traditional morality. She stared at the documents for a long, agonizing 20 minutes. The silence in the deposition room was so thick it was hard to breathe. I watched as the absolute certainty in her eyes fractured, replaced by a profound, sickening realization of exactly what her son had become. When Evelyn finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a ragged whisper, but it echoed like a gunshot. She looked directly at Nolan's attorney and explicitly refused to lie. She formally withdrew herself from the witness list, stating on the official legal record that she could not, in good conscience, support a man who would steal a woman's ancestral home through deliberate fraud. She walked out of the conference room without looking back, leaving her son entirely isolated, stripped of even his own bloodline's protection. The presiding family court judge, having reviewed the mountain of irrefutable, data-driven counter-evidence, immediately struck down Nolan's emergency petition for exclusive occupancy. Furthermore, the court officially scheduled the final, binding hearing to resolve the possession of the house, the calculation of the dissipated joint assets, and the liability regarding the fraudulent encumbrance attempts. I walked out of the West Haven County Courthouse and stood on the wide concrete steps, breathing in the cold, sharp air. I looked out at the city traffic, the adrenaline pumping steadily through my veins. I was stepping into the final stretch of this brutal marathon. I knew with absolute, terrifying clarity that this was no longer a simple battle over a broken marriage or bruised pride. This was an existential fight. Nolan had tried to systematically erase my name, my reputation, and my history from the very address where I grew up. He had tried to render me invisible, and I was going to make absolutely certain that the court permanently burned his fictional narrative to ashes. The final hearing convened on a crisp Thursday morning inside the heavy, oak-paneled walls of the West Haven County Family Court. The atmosphere inside the room felt nothing like a standard domestic dissolution. There were no tearful pleas, no bitter arguments over who would keep the living room furniture, and no emotional theater. It felt exactly like a high-stakes corporate tribunal, cold, precise, and completely devoid of oxygen. I sat perfectly still beside Mara Keene, wearing a charcoal gray suit, watching Nolan take his seat across the aisle. His usual polished arrogance had entirely eroded, replaced by the frantic, hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man who finally realized the walls were closing in. Mara did not begin her presentation with a grand, emotional opening statement. She stood up and methodically unspooled the trap we had spent weeks building. She presented the pristine, unbroken title chain of the Briar Glen property, legally establishing my sole generational ownership beyond a shadow of a doubt. She introduced the forensic financial audit of the Sable Arc Holdings shell account, tracing every single stolen dollar from our joint checking account directly into the speculative void of the Juniper Trace commercial development. She laid out the locksmith's sworn affidavit, the commercial appraiser's visitation logs, and the luxury staging invoices billed directly to Nolan's personal credit lines. Finally, she submitted my official ethics clearance letter from the Transit Authority, permanently incinerating his pathetic claim that I was using my government position to retaliate against him. The most suffocating tension in the courtroom arrived when Sloan Mercer was called to the witness stand. Faced with the permanent revocation of her real estate broker license and the terrifying specter of federal wire fraud charges, her loyalty to my husband evaporated instantly. She sat in the witness chair, looking small and severely diminished without her luxury vehicle and her tailored emerald blouses. Under Mara's relentless questioning, Sloane's voice cracked. "He told me the property was his to leverage," Sloane testified, refusing to make eye contact with Nolan. "He explicitly promised me that the Briar Glen house would belong to us both the moment he finished managing his wife. He assured me the equity was fully clear to back the bridge loan for our shared commercial empire." "And did he ever indicate that Addison Bishop was aware of this transaction?" Mara asked, her voice echoing sharply in the silent room. "No," Sloane whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. "He told me she was too exhausted and disconnected to notice anything until the closing was already finished." Then came the definitive digital kill shot. Mara called a forensic technology specialist to the stand. The expert connected a secure tablet to the courtroom monitors, projecting the raw data extracted directly from Nolan's personal laptop and our home network router. The expert demonstrated, down to the exact second, that Nolan's Internet Protocol address had accessed the digital signature portal using my forged credentials on a specific Thursday afternoon. The corresponding location data, backed by my Transit Authority swipe card logs, proved definitively that I was over 200 miles away, leading a scheduled safety inspection at the Larkspur Depot. Nolan's attorney desperately tried to salvage the burning wreckage of his client's defense. He stood up and tried to pivot the narrative back to a tragic marital misunderstanding. "Your Honor," his attorney pleaded, gesturing weakly toward Nolan, "my client was an overwhelmed husband making poor, panicked financial choices out of a desperate desire to provide a better future for his family. This was a lapse in judgment, not a malicious criminal enterprise." The presiding magistrate, a seasoned judge with absolutely zero tolerance for perjury or financial abuse, cut him off immediately. "Counselor, you are severely misreading the temperature of this courtroom," the judge stated, his voice radiating fright contempt. "This is no longer a matter of broken marital vows or emotional neglect. It is the deliberate, documented creation of a fraudulent encumbrance on a legally separate, ancestral asset. Your client did not make a mistake. He orchestrated a heist." The gavel fell with a heavy, wooden finality that resonated in my chest. The judge awarded me exclusive use, possession, and absolute legal control of the Briar Glen property immediately and permanently. Furthermore, the court formally recognized the exact sum of joint assets Nolan had dissipated into his personal corporate shell over the past 12 months. That entire amount was aggressively docked from his final division of the legitimate marital estate, leaving him with virtually nothing but his own crushing legal debt and the clothes on his back. The professional execution followed the legal one within 48 hours. Once the full unsealed court transcripts reached the compliance department of Nolan's construction firm and the primary investors of the Juniper Trace project, the reaction was utterly merciless. His company placed him on immediate, mandatory administrative leave pending a formal termination hearing, without the massive collateral of my home to secure the final bridge loan. His equity buy-in for Juniper Trace collapsed completely. The private lenders pulled their funding on a Tuesday morning, and the entire development deal imploded, taking his reputation and his career down into the rubble. I kept Briar Glen exactly as my grandfather had left it to me. During the final asset division, I agreed only to restructure a small fraction of the legitimate, shared renovation debt that we had actually incurred together over the years. But I dictated the terms, and I controlled the timeline. The carriage house in the backyard, the very space he had staged as a luxurious trap to sell my future, underwent one final, permanent renovation. I completely stripped out the pretentious commercial bar, the abstract art, and the leather executive chairs. I moved in a heavy oak desk, 3 massive steel filing cabinets, and a complex multi-monitor workstation. It became the official headquarters for my newly launched private risk assessment and contract auditing consultancy. I turned the site of his greatest betrayal into the foundation of my own independent empire. Several months later, the brutal winter finally gave way to a crisp, bright spring. I walked out onto my front porch late one Friday evening after a long, deeply satisfying day of client negotiations. I had just finished reprogramming the master security codes for the smart locks and the heavy iron driveway gate. I stood leaning against the wooden railing, the evening breeze cooling my face, and looked down at the empty stretch of concrete below. I stared at the exact spot where a pearl-white luxury vehicle had once parked diagonally, aggressively blocking my path. I thought about the woman who had sat behind that wheel, looking at me with cold, entitled eyes as if I did not exist, simply waiting for my husband to clear me away like household clutter. I thought about the man who had walked out of my front door, carrying my stolen future in a leather folder, entirely convinced that I was too weak to stop him. Now, the driveway was completely empty. There was absolutely no one waiting for him there. There was no one waiting for him anywhere in my life. The storm had passed. The wreckage had been cleared. And as I turned around to walk back inside, I realized the absolute truth. The house, the story, and the beautiful, quiet rest of my life all remained exactly where they belonged, with me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.